For several hours today, officials from the United States and from Ukraine sat opposite each other round a table in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And then after hours and hours and hours of talks, we got a statement from the US State Department and the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, about what they'd agreed.
Today, we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation.
Let's read the runes literally about what was discussed and what was agreed. And we're joined now by somebody who's been in many of these meetings in their long career, both as Britain's ambassador to Washington and as the UK National Security Advisor. Welcoming him back to Newscast, it's Lord Darrach. Kim Darrach, hello.
Hi, it's nice to be back. Thank you.
Right. So just before we started recording, we got the statement from the State Department, so the readout of the meeting. And I want to go through that line by line with you as a seasoned diplomat so you can decode it for us. But before we do that, just how much do you think was kind of riding diplomatically on this meeting in Saudi Arabia?
For the Americans, for the American negotiators, really quite a lot because of all the troubles they have back home over what's happening economically. And just because they've been putting such a weight on making progress here, and also because they've put such extraordinary pressure on Ukraine. They had a lot of international criticism over this. They've now got an excuse, which they've done, to lift that ban, that pause on military support and intelligence support. And that's kind of crucial, because otherwise they were, in effect, helping Russia.
Yeah, and I suppose before we do our textual analysis, that is the main outcome in concrete terms of this meeting, that US military aid and US intelligence will be heading back to Ukraine, having been stopped for about a week or so.
I think that's right. And I think that there will be a lot of people in the US system who will have been really hoping for this, because they must have felt in such an awkward position with that pause having been initiated. The risk for them was that when those Russian attacks, missiles, drones, whatever, came raining in on Ukrainian cities, the lack of intelligence and thus the lack of forewarning would have led to Ukrainian deaths. And who would have wanted that on their consciousness?
Right, let's dive into this statement. And the first couple of sentences are basically a reset in the Ukraine-US relationship after that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office a few days ago. And the first couple of sentences are all about both nations praising the bravery of Ukrainian people in defense of their nation. And then the Ukrainian delegation reiterated the Ukrainian people's strong gratitude to President Trump, the US Congress, and the people of the United States. That's basically that's making amends for 2 weeks ago, isn't it, in the Oval Office?
That's trying to draw a line under the Oval Office punch-up. And it is in a balanced way, because the Americans are recognizing, as all of us do, Ukrainian fortitude in withstanding the Russian invasion for so long. And then you have this gratitude, which should at least please J.D. Vance, if nothing else.
Yes. So then we get on to the real meat of what they agreed today. And so I'll read this out in full and then get your take on it. Ukraine expressed readiness to accept the US proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which can be extended by mutual agreement of the parties and which is subject to acceptance and concurrent implementation by the Russian Federation. The United States will communicate to Russia that Russian reciprocity is the key to achieving peace. That sounds like proposals for a ceasefire, but only sounds like and only proposals.
Yeah. It tells me two or three things. Number one, there isn't a ceasefire unless the Russians agree to it. So they've got to take this deal, this Ukrainian acceptance, off to Moscow or wherever they want to meet the Russians and say, are you okay with the ceasefire too? I don't know whether there'll be any Russian problems with this. I can't see any reason why there should be, Adam, and I'll tell you why. Because neither side is giving away anything on substance by agreeing to a ceasefire. They just say, okay, we'll pause while we talk about whether we can go further. So you would think on the face of it, Russia should be okay with that. But who knows? Who knows? There may be something that I'm not thinking of that they will have a problem with.
But it just reinforces what's been agreed here. It's been agreed between the Ukraine and the US that this will be their opening position for a conversation that the US will then have with Russia. That is not anything that looks like long-term peace negotiations between Moscow and Kyiv.
Absolutely not. There is no mention really there of substance, and it's not even what are called proximity talks when you have one delegation in one room in a building and the other delegation in the other room, people shuttle between them. This is long distance negotiations at this stage because the Americans have to jet off somewhere and meet the Russians.
Which is why we need to keep all of this in proportion today. Right, then we get the sentence about lifting the pause on intelligence sharing and security assistance, which we've already talked about. Then there's the sentence that Zelensky always talks about, which is the return of prisoners of war and the release of civilian detainees. And it makes you realize that actually there's a whole lot more that will have to be agreed here other than just a ceasefire at sea, in the air, about drones. There's actually a lot of other issues that will need to be resolved, and quite emotive ones as well.
Yeah, that's the Ukrainians saying, and by the way, if we get into ceasefire talks, we start talking about a durable peace, we are going to raise all of these issues, just to give you advance warning.
Yeah, then we get some practicalities. Both delegations agreed to name the negotiating teams and immediately begin negotiations towards an enduring peace that provides for Ukraine's long-term security. The United States committed to discussing these specific proposals with representatives from Russia. The Ukrainian delegation reiterated European partners should be involved in the peace process. That tells us a little bit about, that we're still quite a long way from a big table with everyone sat around it at the same time.
It does, and tells you two things. One, that the Ukrainians, at least, are committing to start quickly, because these are not going to be easy negotiations. So if it's a 30-day ceasefire, then you need to get on with it on day one of those 30 days. Second, the Ukrainians say we want the Europeans at the table. It does not say the United States agreed to that. So that is still up in the air.
Also, I'm just thinking that couple of words where the fact that they both agreed that they should be working towards an enduring peace that provides for Ukraine's long-term security. Now, that sounds like maybe a bit of movement from the US on this idea of providing what they call security guarantees, the US somehow being involved in Ukraine staying secure and sovereign for a long time, as opposed to just ending the fighting at the moment.
Yes, it does, Adam. But there is a detached tone to what the US say. The US are saying, yes, we agree there should be security guarantees. Unless I mishear it, there is no hint in there that the US will be part of that. So it can still be something where the US say that's for Europeans alone.
Yes, the US can be in favor of there being security, but not in favor of contributing to that security. Yeah, interesting. And then we get the last sentence, which is about our old friend, the minerals deal. And they say both countries' presidents agreed to conclude as soon as possible a comprehensive agreement for the critical mineral resources. So that's still no commitment to actually when they'll do it.
Yeah, and if I was Ukraine, I would stall on that for as long as possible, because why would you give that away until you had seen the color of American money or what kind of peace deal they're going to propose?
So I suppose now that we've read through all of this together, I think this is, 1.5 steps forward on quite a long journey?
Yeah, look, can I say two things about it, Adam? Number one, yes, it's good to have a ceasefire. I think it will be fantastically oversold in Washington, and you will find Trump saying essentially, peace is on our doorstep. And I just remember I dealt with a lot of trouble spots during my career. Go back to Bosnia. There was a time when the EU would agree with both parties when we were trying to stop the war in Bosnia between the Serbs and the Bosniaks. They'd agree a ceasefire once a fortnight, and they always broke down because one side or other would start shooting and then it all broke down. So even the ceasefire can be quite fragile and can break down. Doesn't need very much to make it break down. And if one side wants it to break down, then that's quite easy to arrange. Second, let's remember that on the one hand, the Ukrainians want their land back and they want complete freedom to do what they, in terms of future orientation, joining NATO, joining the EU, any of these things, they want that. The Russian position is they keep all the land. They keep Ukraine can never join NATO, and Ukraine has to demilitarize. So there's a vast gulf on the substance between Russia and Ukraine. So this is just a ceasefire, good, a step forward, 1.5 steps forward. But there's a long road to go to get a durable peace.
I'm intrigued by something you said right at the start of our conversation, which was referring to the trouble and the turmoil on the American stock market and the fact that Trump is getting quite a lot of criticism for his economic policy domestically now, because people are starting to see the effects of it in the US. What do you think the linkage could be between that and this? Does this give him an incentive to, I don't know, maybe be a bit kinder to Ukraine because that helps the deal, or is there an incentive for him to get even more dramatic with Ukraine because it distracts from kind of bread and butter issues in the US? I'm just not sure.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I was thinking of it purely in terms of this may change, particularly since Trump, I'm sure, will, as I say, massively oversell the importance of this deal. It changes the 24-hour news cycles in the sense that this might, for a while, displace the economic turmoil at the top of the charts, and he will claim it's a huge personal success for him and his administration. So it's a bit of good news when mostly there's bad news around for him, and bad news that won't go away quickly. In terms of how he now behaves, that's a big known unknown, because everything he's said so far suggests that his idea of a peace deal amounts to Ukrainian capitulation. But we haven't had very much detail from him. So I still think the jury is essentially out on quite what the Americans will put on the table or suggest. And then you have the Brits and the French supposedly working on some ideas as well. So I think there's all to play for on that. But so far, to the extent Trump has spoken on the substance here, it has looked a pretty bleak offer for the Ukrainians.
And just before I let you go to continue your evening, Kim, we've got some news from the Reuters news agency saying that Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is going to visit Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin at some point in the very near future. And I suppose that will be the first kind of... Actually, no, it's not. I was going to say it's the first... We've already had the first contacts because Rubio met Lavrov, but I suppose this feels a bit more like the rubber hitting the road in terms of negotiations.
And it's interesting for one other reason, Adam, which is that initially a guy called Keith Kellogg, who is a retired American general, was meant to be the envoy and the negotiator on Ukraine. Steve Witkoff, on the back of his success with Netanyahu, I don't know him, but everything I read suggests he's a genuinely, rather than self-advertising, tough cookie. Sending him off to meet the Russians, and especially if he meets Putin, seems to me a very interesting move, and suggests to me also that he has become the negotiator of choice for the Trump administration, really whatever theatre and whatever issue.
But that's interesting because that's not somebody being sent to Moscow to kind of cozy up to the Kremlin, is it?
This guy doesn't do cozying up from what I read.
Kim, thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So Kim talked a few times there about the turmoil in the financial markets in the United States. That is something I discussed a couple of hours ago with the BBC's economics editor, Faisal Islam. And Faisal is here. Hello.
Hi, Adam.
I've just had a marketing email from my banking app saying...
Are you sure it's true? Is it not a scam?
It says, investing has never been simpler. Which is not the case today, is it, if you're trying to invest in America?
No, because the stock market, it fell very sharply yesterday. Really pretty punchy falls. And it's not just a one-off. We've now seen basically approaching a correction, as we call it. And it's not, it's really pretty... starting to concern the markets. And I think the key dynamic here is that there was always an assumption that there would be a self-restraining factor, that the market's the one thing that Donald Trump would listen to, apart from his own instinct. And when they go down, he thinks he's got a problem and he tries to half reverse.
Just because it's a very visible thing. You can see it on a graph. And it's a red line.
It's unarguable. I mean, I wouldn't entirely exclude the possibility that you could start arguing about what the real value of the Dow is, but it is unarguable. It has gone down, in particular those tech stocks and then in the Nasdaq, and I'm sure we'll come on to the specifics of the Tesla share price, which fell 15% yesterday. It's bounced back up a little bit today, but yeah, that is that real. It's not the real economy, but it is a verdict of sorts on the profitability of American companies, and in saying, potentially pretending that he doesn't care about that as a metric, that he doesn't care if the US goes into a short-term recession because it's for the greater good over the long term. he has communicated a higher pain threshold than we had realised, than the markets had realised, than business had realised, and that has spooked everybody.
And just explain what you mean by that, about what Trump has conveyed in the last day or so.
So he gave an interview, and he specifically was asked, aren't you concerned about the markets? Aren't you concerned about the prospect of a recession? Some very smart, real-time assessments of the US economy suggest that it is contracting right now. And he essentially said, no, I'm not. I want, the Chinese look at this over 100 years. Why are we obsessed with quarter-to-quarter movements in share prices and then results of companies? Which is a very different message than we've had from him before. So it must have been very purposeful. And the rationale behind it was to say, everyone's assumption, I literally heard this from a Fortune 500 top American business leader, whenever the stock market goes down, it'll stop Trump from doing things that are too, quote unquote, crazy. Well, he's saying...
But if he becomes untethered from that...
that unleashed,
it's going to have no
so
limits.
Therefore, where is the limit to this trade war escalation?
And those comments follow his comments at the weekend where he appeared to not rule out a recession as well. And that had a massive effect on the markets the day before.
Yes, again, showing a higher pain threshold on the economy and on markets than had previously been realised. In fact, what's happened is that Donald Trump as candidate, President Trump, says a lot of stuff that sounds concerning economically for the globe. Maybe there's a rationale back home, but for the globe generally. And then everybody sorts of tries to cope with it and says, oh, no, it won't really happen. Oh, no, it'll be fine. Oh, they won't really do retaliation. Oh, it'll be delayed. And everything's basically starting to happen as he said it. And so it makes you think, European Union, okay, that's going to happen too. Spread to farm products. So you've got steel and aluminium imminently. So yeah, you start to think, okay, so actually what he said we should take note of and think and assume more that it is going to happen than it's not.
But it's interesting, in the first thing you've gone to in your explanation of this is Trump's comments about his tolerance of economic pain. The first thing you didn't go to was tariffs, which is the really obvious thing he's been doing. But I suppose that is a factor too.
Yes, but they've been sort of hokey-cokeying on this the whole time, haven't they? They've been like all on, half off, put back on again. Today they've just been doubled against Canada for steel and aluminium based on something that's happened with electricity. There's a certain sort of random movement to it all. Obviously, the uncertainty in and of itself, it's a cliche about the economy and markets, but the uncertainty is a factor here. And you can see it have a real-world, tangible impact in, for example, the trade data, where it's clear there's been stockpiling in America from mainly companies of the sorts of goods that they feel may be tariffed. So
trying to get them in before the tariffs come in.
Get them in across the border. There's a lot of gold in there. There's computers, there's phones, there's cars. That just costs money. The world economy is run on very quick turnarounds. You don't want stock hanging around in ports or in warehouses. It's all about just in time, just in sequence delivery. When you have this sort of intervention, it all goes up in the air.
And just unpack a bit the episode that has just occurred before we started recording this episode of Newscast on Tuesday afternoon at about 4:30, which is this Canadian electricity thing.
Yeah.
Just take us through what's happened there.
So the provincial premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, has been pretty robust on what he can do, constantly sort of threatening the US, really sort of muscular attempt to say there will be consequences. Essentially, you rely on Canada. Canada and the US have a very integrated economy. You rely on Canada on this. You threaten us with totally unjust tariffs. We will return serve, as it were. And he's done that with not an import tariff, but an export tariff. So he's charging for the export of Canadian electricity, which goes to 3 states, New York, Michigan, another one that I've forgotten. But it goes to those 3. It's not across the whole of the US, but it's focused in the Northeast. And that would increase the bills of Americans by about $100. So that's material. And President Trump, in a sort of furious Truth Social post, has hit back and doubled those tariffs on steel and aluminium to 50%, and also decried the idea that they are kind of messing with basic American safety. Why would you do this on electricity?
Yeah.
So sounding pretty tense.
I just Googled while you were talking the neighboring states of Ontario, and I narrowed it down to Wisconsin or Minnesota. But then Jack, who's producing this episode, says it's Minnesota.
Okay, there we go.
So that's another stage in the kind of the trade war between the US and Canada. What are potential next stages for that? Because that seems to be heating up. That's not cooling down.
No, and also we have Mark Carney waiting in the wings as PM designate. Not entirely sure when he actually becomes prime minister.
It's a bit weird, isn't it? Yeah.
But he was something to do with King Charles and the Governor General. But at this point, I will definitely we will defer to our Canadian version of Newscast of the episode.
Front burner.
Yeah. But he is a markets man. He's a man of the sort of multilateral system, so he knows about negotiations and he knows what triggers markets and he knows what triggers inflation. So he has, like Doug Ford, been extremely robust. Yes, Canada is smaller. Yes, Canada will hurt from these tariffs from the US. But Canada has the capacity to really focus the mind of certain American people, of American businesses, of the stock market, focus its efforts on those things that are material for inflation, and ultimately focus the mind of Congress. So much of, almost all of what Trump has been doing has been executive fiat, executive order. A lot of this stuff really has to be legislated for. So how much of Congress, how many of the senators are up for this? A massive trade war with their northern neighbour, their key ally. And then even more significant could be, are there more sort of sceptical voices within the administration? Doesn't sound like there are right now, but I noted, and I haven't tracked this, but I certainly noted at an earlier stage, the likes of Elon Musk had not tweeted hugely about tariffs, right? We know from the Tesla results day that they have said that tariffs are a material impact for their profits and revenues because they have parts from China, from Canada, and from Mexico. So there are business leaders that are deeply concerned. But I think the basic picture is this, Adam, which is this Canada-US axis, this trade war that many had hoped would sort of solve itself through rationality is getting deeper, it's entrenching, and you can see a pathway of escalation. For example, Mark Carney.
I was going to say, what's the next thing Canada could make more expensive so that American consumers notice and then can be angry with Donald Trump about?
Potash for fertilizer, which is essential for their farmers. And then the big one, which again, they're just generally bewildered in Canada. The deficit is caused by exports of energy and oil.
The trade deficit.
The trade deficit. So the problem, the ripping off of 200 billion that he talks about, much of it is literally Canada sending subsidized crude oil that is straight to the refineries of the Midwest and then straight on to the gas stations of the Midwest, where I'd imagine you'd find a high proportion of Trump voters. So, when this is really serious now, it gets...
And so Canada could either stop sending the oil so that those petrol stations run dry, or it could stop subsidizing the oil so that the petrol becomes more expensive.
Yeah.
Or I suppose it could send the oil, I don't know, to us.
Yes, I think you need to build some pipelines. That'd take a bit of time, but certainly that's what they're suggesting already. They're leaning in that direction to have east-west pipelines rather than... Clearly, this would be very damaging for Canada's revenues, fiscal revenues for its exports. But yes, that is the direction of travel. Indeed, I looked back over the chat I had with Mark Carney about 6 weeks ago.
You hardly ever mentioned that.
And he said that it turns out to be quite a good scoop.
Quite a historical document, yeah, exactly.
No, he said he'd ask for the subsidies back. So you see, I've just mentioned two examples there. Now, clearly the power is on the American side, but the ability to cause mutual damage is there. The rationale on both sides is there. President Trump doesn't think that tariffs are going to damage America or cause inflation in America, so he'll carry on. On the Canadian side, this robust approach is proving extremely popular at a time when you expect an imminent election. You have the ingredients there for deep, entrenched trade tension that escalates for the next few weeks, and that's before the idea that the scope spreads to the European Union.
And just historically, that is so mad because there were never really two closer neighbours than the USA and Canada in the last 100 years.
We should step back and say, their economies are entwined. President Trump negotiated a trade deal with Canada that's been blown up now. They're NATO allies. They have combined in the part of Five Eyes. But do not underestimate the extent to which for Canada, maybe if it was just about trade and tariffs, you could come to a negotiation. But when you hear, and they're taking it very seriously now, it's no joke for the Canadians, when you hear the president repeatedly say, we're going to use economic power to coerce them into becoming the 51st state, or to invite them, or to suggest that they become the 51st state, they're taking that really seriously now. I mean, how can you actually negotiate with someone who says, even jokingly, we're going to annex your country? I mean, you can't have. Can you have a negotiation? It takes the shackles really off the Canadian response. It's like, are the Canadian people going to say, oh, you should just give Trump that little bit, give him a win? How can you give him a win? Carve off a bit of Manitoba, I don't know, some island off. They're not going to do that, right? So you're in a very tricksy position.
You mentioned Elon Musk and you mentioned his company Tesla. I mean, Tesla stock has become one of the biggest kind of casualties of this whole market movement, hasn't it?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to look at this. It is now halved in value since its peak, but it actually doubled in value since the actual election of Trump. So it went up. Marched up the hill on the assumption that Musk would benefit from the inside track of government, and now all of that has gone. So it's halved in value. It lost 15% yesterday. It's back up a little bit as we speak today, but it's still well down. And that is a combination of the fact that in Europe, certainly in January, we're not sure that that's continued to February. There were significant falls in sales in Europe as he intervened, I think is probably a fair word to say, light word to say, in European politics.
The German elections,
very, very, in a very forthright manner. But we're also now seeing protests in the US. Tesla was valued hugely more than any other car company, valued like a tech company. So that was partly because of the brand. The brand appealed to a certain demographic that were bothered about, climate change. Can you imagine an experiment in trying to, experiment on that demographic than what we have seen in terms of Elon Musk? And there are questions.
It's like a reverse Jaguar rebrand.
Well, this may well be why Jaguar thought there might be some sort of market a window for them. You're also now seeing other EV manufacturers, electric vehicle manufacturers, so Kia and Polestar, Chinese and Korean, the other way around actually, Korean and Chinese, they are starting to put out sort of cheeky, viral, guerrilla advertising aimed at Tesla drivers, saying, change your EV. It comes at a time when other companies have caught up with the technology. So it's a very delicate time for them.
Faisal, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast, which we were recording at about 6:30 on Tuesday evening. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.